boy.
Canada.
Canada.
Well, doesn't it derive from a Ganyaka word?
It's village.
As Indigenous people, we are used to our stories getting a little twisted. So listen up as we set the record straight. I'm Ganyahtiyo. Please join me as we hear from dozens of Indigenous people. Together, we will decolonize our words and our minds on the Telling Our Twisted Histories podcast. You can find episodes on the CBC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is a CBC podcast.
Danse, Anin, Boozhoo, hello and welcome. This is Unreserved on CBC Radio 1. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. Today, we share some good news stories from across Turtle Island. Cultural repatriation. What happened when a self-described cultural caretaker returned decades of history to the first Innu cultural guardian?
I came across a box with a cassette, and it was of my father, an interview with my father.
Oh my goodness.
And my little girl was actually in the room with me at the time. So I got to play my dad, his voice, for my daughter who hasn't had the opportunity to hear her grandpa.
Plus, historical reclamation, a new history curriculum in northern Quebec, is teaching its students from a Cree perspective.
This means that we're able to take strength from our past, we're able to acknowledge past traumas, but we're able to deal with them in the present from a position of strength, acknowledging everything that we've brought with us and our own resilience and how that's going to carry us forward into the future.
And meet Canada's first Inuk heart surgeon.
When I'm in the OR, am I practicing my culture in the traditional sense? No, and it's not always at the forefront of my mind, but just that connection to my family, to my ancestors, to our values and traditions is very strong. And so I feel, again, very fortunate that I was raised with our culture very much part of our day-to-day life.
All that and some music from Norwegian coming at you on Unreserved. All across Canada, there are thousands of Indigenous stories waiting to be told. These stories are usually passed down from generation to generation. But as the elders who carry them pass on, these stories stop. Thankfully, there are cultural guardians and allies to save these stories and ensure they can be told to our children and grandchildren. Jody Asheny is the first Innu cultural guardian. Peter Armitage is an anthropologist and a self-described cultural caretaker. Recently, Peter gave back an extraordinary archive, and they both join me to tell me all about it. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jody, I just want to start with you. Please tell us, what is a cultural guardian?
It kind of evolved into a whole big, huge job description. I actually found a grant so that I could start working on a feasibility study for the cultural center. So I got a 2-year grant from Canadian Heritage with the Innu Nation. And it kind of snowballed from there into a big job. There was a lot of work that needed to be done within the Innu Nation. I was the first one ever, so it's a kind of a pilot project too.
So you say you're the first one, but what is it you actually do day to day?
Day to day, it's everything. Everything comes to me if it's related to culture. I've worked with developing policies with parks to try and have Indigenous insight into their policies. There's astronauts recently, they applied for a research grant through Innu Nation, and it came to me, so I had to approve that, make sure that there was Innu guardians out there and to watch them, how they were training. I made sure there was an archaeologist available on site with them to make sure they weren't disturbing sites.
Did you just say that you had a request from astronauts?
Yeah. I literally just had them here a couple weeks ago. They were here from the Canadian Space Station and from NASA, so they went back to Houston not very long ago. I set up a meeting for them to meet the kids in Nabashish and then to meet and greet in Shadjeet, so it was very exciting. The kids loved it. Yep.
And so they were training in your territory, and you had to make sure that they weren't disturbing the territory. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yep, there's rocks that are similar to rocks on the moon. So there's only two places in all of the world. I think the other place is over Europe. So Gomestassen was a crater. It was actually a meteor hit a million years ago or so. And now this place has moon rocks. So they were there in their suits and geared up to with geologists and searching for what they had to look for on the moon. So yeah, it was pretty interesting stuff.
That is the coolest thing I've heard today, Jody. I'm giving clearance to NASA.
Yeah, I know, right? Their plane was delayed and someone was like, oh, you should have said Houston, we have a problem. I was like, oh, I missed my opportunity. I'll never get to say that again.
Damn it. Well, maybe you will, Houston, we have an Inu.
Yeah, they want to come back in a couple of years, so we'll see.
There you go. There's your next opportunity. So your community is Shahajit. What was it like growing up there?
Well, my father was a big political leader. He was, I guess, the chief and for the band council, and he was also president for the Indonesian chief land claim negotiator. He started the protests for the low-level flying and over Innu territory. So he was a big figure in the community, but he also traveled the world telling people of the Innu and our fight for our rights. So he was well known, and for us, we sat at every dinner table and everything involved politics, and this is what we deserve. We deserve to be equal. We deserve to have clean water, healthy animals. We deserve to be able to watch over our own culture. So it was kind of instilled in me from a very young age, but it was, I got to live in the country too. So 4 months of every year, we would be taken out of school in April, and then we'd be in the country for 4 months and live off the land. We were taught our cultural ways to respect the animals, the animal masters. So I was very fortunate until I was 9 years old to live that lifestyle. So I got a chance to be, I guess, live and breathe and realize the importance of our culture through that. So I was very lucky.
Were you always curious about preserving culture? Was that something that you felt you wanted to do at an early age?
About 7 years old.
Wow.
At that point, it was okay. Now I'm going to be an archaeologist. I never changed my career idea. Other kids were like, "Oh, I want to be a nurse," or "I want to be a doctor. I want to be a fireman." And I was like, "I want to be an archaeologist," and they looked at me like, "What? What is that?" But it actually stemmed from my father going to the Mishkamal area. It was the Smallwood Reservoir from when they flooded the Upper Churchill. And Peter Armitage actually went on this trip with him. And he came back. I remember lying just in his arm in the bed as a child and him telling me the story about how there was nothing left on our land. It was a really important place for the Innu, a gathering place that everyone used. And my grandfather was there. He hunted, he trapped in that area. And there was nothing. They found a rusty bucket and a few shards of like porcelain plates, but there was no evidence that the Innu existed in this land. And that always struck a chord with me that, I can't let that happen ever again. So hearing the sadness, I guess, in my father's voice, it was a hard story, but he also told me about they were sitting down on a bank resting and just kind of real defeated because there was nothing, him and my uncle. And they were looking down and they seemed like this odd rock, what they thought was rock, but it turned out to be a skull eroding out of the sandbank, and there was nothing really left of her other than the skull and some bones from her arms, and everything else was gone, eroded away with the flooding of the Upper Churchill. And that I think stuck with me, that story of, we can't let this happen to our ancestors. And he always made the point to say that people were buried somewhere for a reason. So for her to be disturbed, for her to be washed away, not even together, it was really hard for me to accept. And thinking about it, it's like, oh, for future generations, for my father, I'm going to go ahead and go to school, and I'm going to do something. I'm going to make sure this never happens again for the Innu people and our history being wiped away. So I was right from 7 years old.
Thank you for sharing that. And what was your father's name?
Daniel Ashney.
Now, you mentioned Peter in that story, and let's bring him into the conversation. He's just kind of sitting there in the corner by himself. Peter, you okay?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I'm listening very closely to everything that Jody has said. Yes.
Now, you started working with the Labrador Innu in 1981. What drew you to this community?
Well, I'm originally from the Vancouver area, and I moved east in August '81 to work with Dr. Adrian Tanner, who had worked for many years with the James Bay Cree, and he was one of the expert witnesses for the Cree in their fight against the James Bay hydroelectric agreement and an attempt at a court injunction. So at first I wanted to work with the James Bay Cree, but we quickly decided that there was enough going on in the James Bay territory, and maybe I should go and work with the Innu people in Quebec instead. But even before I went to Laramie on the Quebec North Shore, I started to I could play a supportive role with the Labrador Innu in some of their important political struggles at the time. And then it simply evolved into doing use and occupancy research and cultural research with the Innu over more than 30 years.
That's a long time. So there you are, a skinny white dude walks into the community. How did you go about building trust with community members?
Well, in part because, I was following in the footsteps of other researchers who already had those relations of trust, like Adrian Tanner, who I mentioned previously, who had worked with the James Bay Cree. He had also worked in Tishajit. And then his partner, Margaret McKenzie, was well known because she'd done research there in 1982, linguistics research. And I went there the summer of '84 to work on an Innu dictionary project under Marguerite's guidance, you see. So the fact that I guess, I came recommended by people who they already trusted made a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's up to you and your particular personality to make things work, and and to do the work of building friendships, and with friendship comes trust. And then I became heavily involved in their fight against military flight training. Jody spoke about that. And I participated in demonstrations. I was an expert witness in a court case, expert witness for the Innu. I was part of their land claim negotiating team. So there was a lot of years of close relationship there, and at times very personal.
Yeah.
Very personal, and you're led into people's lives. I used to stay with Jody and her family when she was a toddler, I think. Yeah, and her and her sister had to give up their bedrooms for visiting Peter Armitage or John Ophius, one of their lawyers. So
she's still mad about that, Peter. She's still mad.
It was always fun staying at your house, Jody. I mean, we've talked about that in the past. And, your father is someone who I greatly respected. And, it's hard to think about him without getting emotional. He was a very fine man and very talented, honest, wise leader. And we all miss him terribly. So, but I guess you got to eavesdrop on a lot of interesting conversations around the kitchen table over the years.
Let's dive into that a little bit, Jody. What kinds of memories do you have from those visits?
Oh, there's so many. Bringing them into the country, I think, was the most fun part. Getting them cut wood that they've never used an axe before. Little things like that everyone would stand around watching them and giggle and laugh away, and my dad would be there making fun. And a way to do, I guess, like an initiation. My father had to do this to everyone that ever went to the country with us that was not from here. He would kill a porcupine, and to blow up a porcupine, you had to blow up their bum so you could singe it. And I think that was the initiation for every person that ever came. My father had to make them use their lips. He wouldn't give them a straw.
Oh, and you did this, Peter? Did you do the porcupine balloon?
My first attempt at inflating a porcupine was with Daniel, and I had the honor of doing that. And some of the things that were said I can't repeat on a radio show, I'm afraid. But we had a good laugh. Gut-splitting laughter.
That's hilarious.
It was my life. It was fun.
Yeah.
We had people from all over the world stay with us. We were so lucky to have wonderful allies that I got to meet as a kid. That they'd bring us books from all over. They would tell us stories about all over the world. I was very lucky.
Yeah, it sounds like your house is a real community hub.
It was. My mom had to cook for a lot of people very often. Yeah. Yeah.
And so what was that like growing up with all of these people around? Do you feel like it fed into this desire you have to preserve your Innu cultures?
Definitely. That's, I think, probably one of the biggest impacts on my life was having these people, these advocates that wore all different hats. They were environmentalists, forestry people, there were, you name it, they all had a place to stay in my house. They all had a different story that my father sat down and preached the importance of logging in Nitassinan, or low-level flying in Nitassinan, or protecting the language, protecting our culture. There were so many different people that I got to have a taste of everything. And my dad stressed the importance of every single one of these people that I guess it got ingrained into me that, okay, it's your turn now to fight. And I understand a little more now where my father was, because I have a daughter of my own, she's 5, that I adopted from the community. And I want to fight so hard to make sure that she has a culture and a language and a place to go in the future, that it drives me. So I realized that, okay, as a kid, not having my dad around, he was gone a lot. He traveled the world telling people, I talked to him a lot. He was arrested for low-level flying protesting, so I visited him in jail, crying and not wanting to leave him. And all these things now in my head, I'm like, oh, I get it now. I get why he done this. It was for me, my sister. He did it for us so that we would have rights as Innu people, as Innu girls and women, to be able to have equality in the world. So I realize now what my father did and how hard it was for him. But as a kid, you just kind of get envied it, right? You're like, oh, my dad's not here for my birthday. Oh, my dad's not here for this or that. But it's now I realize, having my own daughter traveling and being away, I'm like, oh, I'm doing it for her though. I'm doing it for her grandkids, for her kids. And it makes me connect to my father a lot more, I think, now, understanding why he did it.
Yeah, that's amazing. Peter, you recently decided to give all your research materials back to the Innu Nation. What kind of things did you repatriate to them?
Well, most of what I repatriated, I don't consider to have been my intellectual property. It was pretty much all of it was work that I had done on their behalf because they commissioned it, and it was always very clear that the Innu Nation owned all of the interview material and documents that came out of that research. So, there's very little that I sent back to Labrador that I personally was, owned or was responsible for. My job was basically to be a caretaker of that information, and I did that for over 30 years. But the kind of materials we're talking about are a lot of audio recordings, some audio-visual recordings, transcripts of interviews, and some photographs and slides, maps. These are all documents that came out of land rights research, use and occupancy studies that came out of a study related to Innu burial sites, another one related to sacred sites in Labrador, in the Innu territory, and so on and so forth.
It sounds like a real treasure trove of years and years of people, some that might not even be around. Did you feel a sense of urgency to share these stories and make sure that they got home properly, as it were?
Well, I always saw this custodial responsibility as a sacred trust, because there was a lot of material there, like audio recordings of long deceased Chinooks elders. But they're irreplaceable, and I'm happy that I was able to transmit the materials back to the Innu Nation, and I know that they are in good hands.
And Jody, first of all, when you opened that box per se and found all of this beautiful cultural material and voices and just decades of worth of beautiful Innu culture, how did that feel?
Just thinking about when I was there at Peter's house, I was sitting down in the middle of his living room surrounded by boxes, and I came across a box with a cassette, and in the box was a cassette player, luckily. And it was of my father, an interview with my father.
My goodness.
And my little girl was actually in the room with me at the time. So I got to play my dad, his voice, for my daughter who hasn't had the opportunity to hear her grandpa, because he passed away long before she was born. So in that moment in time, everything kind of just fell into place. As it felt, okay, it's going to come home to the people that need to hear this stuff. And it was a real beautiful moment that she's like, that's my grandpa. That's what he sounds like. So it was a very emotional day. And I didn't expect it to be so emotional. But there was tons of boxes. When I open up another one, there's interviews with elders that have been passed for years, my aunts, my grandparents, and you just can't wait to have our own center now so we can let everyone have this closeness to these people that they've been longing for so long, to be able to hear their great-grandparents and the stories that they wanted their great-grandchildren to hear. That's why they were recorded.
Jody, you just gave me the feels. I'm crying. I'm crying. Peter, how did that feel when when Jody's sitting there listening with her baby, the voice of her father? What was that like for you?
Well, I think there are a number of moments there in the day that we spent together that we got a bit choked up, thinking about people who have passed on. And someone like me, as an outsider working with Indigenous peoples, it's more than a research relationship. It's not just clinical in-out kind of thing. We become entangled in one another's lives, and it goes both ways. My life hasn't always been easy personally, and I've shared some of my trials and tribulations with my Innu friends, and so we talk about all this stuff. And there are many of our friends and family members who have passed on, and it's good to talk about them, and getting together and looking at old photos and listening to audio recordings is a way to remember them. So yeah, it's great, but it's emotional as well, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But Jody, there's more there too of interest to you. I know your father's mother. There's no recording of her, but there are recordings of her parents that you may have not listened to. So your daughter's going to get to listen to her great grandparents.
That's so exciting. And Jody, what are you going to do with all of this stuff now? You mentioned a cultural center.
Yeah, we're in the next stages now. We released our RFP in December, and we got about 7 proposals back from all over Canada. In the center, we want a place for audio storage, media storage, documents. So we want to archive. We need a place for our ethnographic, material. So we have 3 coats at the rooms right now, with caribou skin coats, that need to have the proper humidity, climate control, everything like this. And then we also have huge collections at the Canadian Museum of Heritage and the rooms that have to come back to Shadji. So
Wow.
we're going to have a theater for people to come present. We're going to have outdoor space for people learning to redo canoes. There's just so much, and I wanted it done yesterday.
That's amazing. That sounds like a beautiful, beautiful dream that you're going to make reality. Peter, when you look back at all your years, spent with the Innu, how do you feel like it shaped you as a person?
That's a hard question to answer. There's all this talk of reconciliation these days, and that's a path I went on over 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think about what reconciliation means. I guess I talk about it with non-Aboriginal people from time to time, and people say they're committed to reconciliation. I'm not sure if I trust it. I think a lot of what's going on is quite superficial,
mm-hmm.
and particularly when I see what's going on in the courts, I think that federal and provincial governments continue to fight tooth and nail, and that I don't see a lot of reconciliation at that level. When we get down to matters of real power relations and what really counts, I suppose, at the end of the day. But I'm not the same person because of my experiences with Indigenous people. I'm not just Labrador. I've worked in 22 different Indigenous communities across Canada now, including the Inuvialuit of the Western Arctic. And I see that life change and what I've been given by Indigenous people as an immense gift. I feel privileged to have benefited from the immense generosity of Indigenous people wherever I've worked in different parts of North America. So I consider myself to be a very fortunate person.
Jody, Peter, thank you so much for this conversation today.
Thank you very much for your time.
You gave me the feels.
Yeah, very emotional.
Jody Asheny is the cultural guardian for the Innu Nation. She was in Shahajit, Labrador. Peter Armitage is an anthropologist and longtime friend and ally of the Labrador Innu. He joined us from his home in Newfoundland. You're listening to Unreserved on CBC Radio 1, Native Voice 1, and Sirius XM. I'm Rosanna Deerchild. While the leaves are turning from lush greens to red and orange, and people are breaking out the pumpkin spice, autumn is setting in. Back to School has students looking back on the story of Canada a little differently this year. A new history curriculum in northern Quebec is teaching its students from a Cree perspective. Sarah Pashagumskum is the chairperson of the Cree School Board in northern Quebec. She spoke with CBC Breakaway host Alison Brunette about why rewriting curriculum is an important part of self-determination.
Right now, especially in the context we're living within today, we've been talking about reconciliation for so long. We've been talking about empowerment. We've been talking about self-determination. And that's where this really all comes from. It's how do we move forward as a self-determining nation, giving our children everything they need to know, giving them the tools that they need to move us into that future. And a lot of that has to do with identity construction of our students. And identity is based in the teaching of history. It's based in culture. It's based in language. So history is really a key component to that identity construction for us, and that view of how do we create citizens that are going to be a real contributing part of our self-determining nation. And so when we look at history, it's important for us to facilitate an understanding of our own history so that our students can identify and can define their own identity as empowered Iuch, as empowered Cree. And that means viewing our history from a position of strength and empowerment, and recognizing our sovereignty and who we were before colonization and European incursion, and acknowledging what has changed from the beginning of European incursions into our territory, and recognizing how we've been impacted by colonization and racism, and moving forward in healing and strength.
It sounds like such a well-defined and strong intention for going ahead and creating this curriculum. And I was looking into it, reading a little bit about it. Sounds like there are some real interesting ways you're doing that. There's some suggestions to involve the whole community, in particular elders, in the assignments and classwork. Are you envisioning, let's say, an elder is able to come to the classroom and share their story, speak about their experiences in their life, and create that bond?
Definitely. And in fact, we work that way across the curriculum. We encourage elders and community members to come into our schools and to really create an environment where our schools are part of the community and we draw on community resources. So that type of outreach is very important across the curriculum. Right now, with this history program, we're really encouraging people who have knowledge in the community about different historical issues to come in. But we're also encouraging people who can be support to students to come into, and teachers to come into the schools. A big part of the orientation of this history program is to take a trauma-informed approach to teaching history. And, right now that means dealing with intergenerational trauma. That means dealing with difficult topics such as the residential school experience or the 60s scoop or other actions of genocide or systemic racism. And so when we take this trauma-informed approach, that means recognizing and acknowledging that there is trauma that does exist both in the past and expressed in the present, and recognizing that we're all affected as individuals, as communities, as families, and responding to that trauma within the classroom means that we have to not only bring people who are knowledgeable about those topics that we're exploring in history, but we also have to make sure we're ready to outreach. And so the Cree Health Board has been a huge partner of the Cree School Board for some time now. And in fact, we do things like situate social workers in our schools and have really strong connections with mental health workers and mental health supports in our communities. And then we also make sure that we have support from our Elders Council, both regionally and at the local level, and our women's associations. So this is a real community-driven initiative. This is a real both local and regional initiative, but really focused on taking an approach that's going to be healing and self-determining and also very future-oriented.
Do you think that any of the new curriculum you've created should be implemented in other schools, or maybe the approach of telling those stories, having someone come into the classroom? Is there anything that you think you'd like to see in, I guess, for lack of a better word I can think of right now, the standard, so-called standard curriculum in Quebec?
Definitely. And I think that, there have been so many attempts to redraft history curriculum in Quebec over the past few years. And I think that most of us understand that these have resulted in some changes that have not been very substantial, like the discontinuation of using Amerindian and replacing it with Indigenous, or just, the cursory mention of residential schools, and not any real discussion of the real aim and of residential schools and the real damage of residential schools. And so I think that we have to not lose focus on the fact that redefining history curriculum is really not only an issue of Indigenous education. And if we're really serious about this project of reconciliation, if Canadians and Quebecers are really serious about reconciliation, we need a complete reset. And we really need to re-envision how the entire curriculum is taught. Children need to be able to build an understanding of how we find ourselves in the position we are in today. And that means children who are Quebecois, children who are Indigenous, and they need to understand how Quebec became the province it is today and look at the dispossession from land, settler encroachment on Indigenous territory, things like the development of the seigneurial system, which are, a key component of Quebec history programs. And they need to be re-understood in terms of what does this mean for encroachment on Indigenous territory, and also things like the devastation of populations from the introduction of European disease and the warfare, the germ warfare that was used to affect outcomes of interactions between people. And all of these things really need to be understood in order for our children both Quebecois and Indigenous, to become aware of how their economies of today developed, how the territories of today developed, and how these all became to be as a result of the dispossession of Indigenous people. And only if this is really understood can non-Indigenous people move past racist stereotypes and the misconceptions about Indigenous people and truly begin to be a part of taking responsibility for their part in reconciliation and really moving forward with authentic action. So yes, I definitely think that this is part of a wider view and taking a more critical view of history teaching and learning.
I mean, I know it's a history course, and so a lot of what's in it is, in theory, has happened in the past, but I know your curriculum has, just as you're talking, it sounds like you're trying to draw a thread from the past all the way up into present day efforts, self-determination, self-governance for the Cree people. So it sounds like you're really trying to make it be, understood and I guess felt as one long sequence of events, one long story leading up to now 2021.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this really is this is really our own way of viewing history. When we look at history and we look at the past, we don't view the past as separate from the present. Our present is made up of the past, and our present is also a part of the future. And so, taking this very cyclical way of looking at history, make sure that we're not allowing our children to be stuck in the past or to believe that this present is the present and we'll move forward into the future this way. This means that we're able to take strength from our past, we're able to acknowledge past traumas, but we're able to deal with them in the present from a position of strength, acknowledging everything that we've brought with us and our own resilience and how that's going to carry us forward into the future.
That was Sarah Pashagumscum, chair of the Cree School Board in Northern Quebec, speaking with CBC's Alison Brunette. Speaking of reclaiming history and space, we head to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. On the corner of Richmond and Queen, a bronze statue of Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, once stood. It's an intersection that Melissa Peter Paul often avoided, given Macdonald was responsible for Indian residential schools in Canada. Earlier this year, the statue of Macdonald was removed, and the Migma artist is spending much more time there now. Melissa Peter Paul spoke with CBC's Nicola McLeod.
So I was contacted by the city of Charlottetown to do some sidewalk art in front of the John A. Macdonald statue where he used to sit. So that's what I'm working on now. I have the design all done and I just have to submit it now. And I'm going to do a nice line of Migma double curves. It's such an important symbol to the Migma people. It represents us and, it's kind of like the heart of our culture and who we are. It just has so much meaning to it. And I want all of the Indigenous people, the Migma people, to feel, that they're welcome here and, they're honored here rather than, that statue that was sitting there. I want them to feel comfortable that they're here.
And as a Migma person, to be the one chosen to help revamp this corner, what does that mean to you?
I've always wanted to be a part of revitalization of Migma art here in the city. I've been doing art since I was little, but it's been so important to me to make sure there was more Migma art here in the city because it was lacking that for a long time. So I'm not a descendant of residential school, but my parents and my grandparents were Indian day school survivors. So this is just a way of me honoring all the Migma people, all the Indigenous people in Canada, to just have a little piece of art here, to look at, to honor, to remember.
For those who may not be familiar with you, what mediums do you usually work within, and what are you hoping to achieve with your artwork?
So I work with porcupine quills, birch bark, sweetgrass, sinew, spruce root. All of these materials are from the land, and I harvest all of them. Oh, and I do quill art. So with all of these materials, I do quill work. So my great-great-grandmother was a quill artist. So I've been doing quill work for 7 years now, and I'm kind of branching out in different areas right now.
As we are standing here and we're looking across at where your crosswalk is about to go, what does that feel like to you?
When I used to stand here, I wouldn't even stand here. I would move quickly because I didn't want to look at that statue. It was a reminder, of what was celebrated here in this spot of the city and actually all over the city. And now those feelings are changing. Like, the statue's not there anymore. And, Migma Art is going to be celebrated here, and, Migma Pride. And I'm so excited that I was chosen to do this. I'm excited for it to get done.
During the discussions about keeping the statue, one of the points that was raised was that it's a draw for tourism, that being the birthplace of Confederation is a tourist draw here. What do you think your art or other installations by Migma artists can offer that being the birthplace of Confederation cannot?
We have more history here. We have more stories. We have more traditions, and, we have so many good things about our art and our culture that can be shared. And what that statue did was the total opposite, It celebrated all the bad things that he'd done to us, So it's never going to erase it, We're always going to have the impacts of it in our people, but, there's so much more that we can celebrate. That's, what this is going to mean too. Like, we're still here, whatever he tried to do, and, we're still here. So that's the point of my art being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Alan.
And that was Melissa Peter Paul speaking with CBC's Nicola McLeod in Charlottetown. We love hearing how artists are impacting the world around us, and we also love keeping a pulse on inspiring stories coming out of the medical world. In this case, in St. John's. That's where Dr. Donna Kimilarzak is starting her career as a heart surgeon. And she happens to be Canada's first Inuk heart surgeon. Here she is, speaking with CBC's Jeremy Eaton.
A little backstory, I just spent the last year in the States, and the plan was always to come back to Canada, because I'm Canadian, I love being home, and so I started looking for jobs, and there was a job posted in St. John's. I interviewed, and to be honest, I had just such a good feeling about the group. The cardiologists, the anesthesiologists, the surgeons, it just felt right. I'm a person that really likes to listen to her gut. And I felt, okay, I think this is going to be the right fit. I trained in Ottawa before that, and I know they have a really strong relationship with Ottawa. In fact, right now there's some surgeons that are flying out to come do some cases here. So I still have that connection to folks that I really know and who trained me. So I just felt it'd be a really good fit. And also it helps my fiance is from Ireland, so I knew he'd love it here, which he does. So.
Now, as I said, you're Canada's first Inuk cardiac surgeon. Tell us a little bit about your backstory, where you come from.
Yeah, so I was born in Winnipeg, raised very briefly up in the north where my mother's family is from in Nunavut, but really I was raised in Ottawa. Ottawa's my home. That's where my parents are. And, you know, we lived up north very briefly, but my parents felt I'd have better educational opportunities being in the south in a big city. So we settled in Ottawa where there's a large Inuit population, so we could be connected to our culture. And I was very fortunate to just be a very kind of curious kid with really supportive parents, where at the age of 6, I told them, hey, I wanted to be a neurosurgeon at that age, but I told them I want to be a doctor. And they just said, okay, you're going to have to work hard, but all right, go for it.
I've never been the first in anything. I've been the last in a lot of things, but never the first. What's it like, or what does it mean to you to be the first Inuk cardiac surgeon in Canada?
To be honest, it's not something that I really think of in my day-to-day life. When I set out to become a heart surgeon, it was just very much my selfish want to be a heart surgeon for me. Like, this is what I loved doing. I thought I'd be good at it. This is what I wanted to do. But then this title kind of came associated with it. And so I'm really honored. I'm really humbled, really flattered. And I'm happy to actually have this platform or this opportunity to share my story, because I recognize the importance of young people having role models in their life. And so I had very strong role models. I know a lot of people don't. And so if my story can be, inspiration or motivation or something that just one person can connect with, then that's meaningful to me.
So with you being the first, is there added pressure as well that comes along with that?
It's a good question. I don't recognize if it does. Maybe it does.
I guess as a surgeon, you're used to pressure.
Yeah, exactly. I think when I first started getting some of the attention, I was still a resident doctor, so I was still in training. I didn't have my full license yet. I hadn't passed my board exams. I was like, I'm a nobody. So I definitely felt the pressure because it's like, if you fail, people will know. But now I don't feel like it does. I'm used to the pressure, like you said, and I'm just happy to do something meaningful and hopefully it's positive for others. Besides being in the OR, other interests in medicine are really looking at Indigenous and women's heart health. So there's the Canadian Women's Heart Health Alliance Network, this national organization that looks at improving women's heart health outcomes that I've been fortunate to be a part of. There's a lot of committees that are being formed with the Canadian Medical Association, with the College of Physicians and Surgeons, looking at how do we improve Indigenous health, how do we incorporate Indigenous health curriculum into our residency programs. So I've had a lot of great opportunities presented to me because of attention like this. So hopefully, again, it's meaningful work that I can contribute to. When I'm in the OR, am I practicing my culture in the traditional sense? No, and it's not always at the forefront of my mind, but just that connection to my family, to my ancestors, to our values and traditions is very strong. And so I feel, again, very fortunate that I was raised with our culture very much part of our day-to-day life. So very much important place in my heart. And I'm excited to hopefully get up to Labrador at some point, maybe do some clinics up there, outreach work, get to eat some country food, which would be great. So definitely the food and culture is important to me.
That was Dr. Donna Kimilarzak, Canada's first Inuk heart surgeon, who chose St. John's, Newfoundland as her new home. Thank you to CBC's Jeremy Eaton for bringing us that story. That's it for us this week. Before we go, a quick word about next week's episode. Consider this an invitation for a little ride along.
Out of my way, colonization! Whoa, I'm on a mission. Caution, caution.
Yep, that's me on my bike. Believe me, it's been a while. Join me next week as I cycle through Winnipeg and meet up with some of the Indigenous artists whose sculptures and murals tell a different story about this place we call Canada. Grab your helmet and your water bottle. Next week, we ride. This episode of Unreserved was produced by Braden Alexander, Kim Kasher, and Aaron Knoll. I'm your favorite cousin, Rosanna Deerchild, coming at you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory. Thanks for listening. Ginaskan amit nawi, I go say.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.